Hello and welcome to the Night Shift with Mr. Davis. In this inaugural episode, we'll be laying the groundwork for what's to come with future episodes. Of course, this is all subject to change given the feedback I receive from you all. In theory, this is a scary story podcast with me, Mr. Davis, being your storyteller and guide. I'll be giving a small introduction to each story before it begins, and a bit at the beginning and end. If that sounds like a good time, be sure to show your support for the podcast by dropping a like below, or if you're listening on iTunes, be sure to leave a 5-star review. With that said, let's hop into our story. Returning author Mandon Lysette has an incredibly creepy experience to start us off. This is the story, my first and last experience sleeping in a capsule hotel in Tokyo. I just got back from going on my dream vacation to Japan. For the most part, it was awesome and everything went off without a hitch. My flights were on time, the language barrier wasn't too bad, it was fairly easy getting around, I got to see most of the stuff on my itinerary, the food was delicious. There was only one sore spot that really stands out, and that's the night I stayed at a capsule hotel. I was supposed to stay there 3 nights, but after the first, I ended up using my emergency funds to pay for a hotel the next 2 nights. I think you'll understand why after you read this. I want to start off by stressing how damn exhausted I was. This was the tail end of a 2-week trip where I hadn't taken a single day off, so to speak. We're talking 8 to 10 hours of walking every day, exploring the cities, going to shrines, shopping, and all that other good stuff. I'd started the day bright and early in Osaka, soaking up every bit of the city I could, knowing it might be the last time I got to see it. I took an evening train to Tokyo, which took about 3.5 hours. From there, I headed to Akihabara and explored, dragging my luggage behind with me. I could have left it in a locker at the train station, but that meant doubling back and grabbing it, and I didn't want to subject my feet to that. I decided on a chill evening. I ended up getting so enthralled that I didn't get to the capsule hotel until a bit past midnight. So yeah, I felt like I could have slept through a hurricane. I checked in, got a neat little bracelet with my capsule number, as well as a key to a small locker for my stuff. I somehow managed to wedge my oversized luggage in there. I took a shower and then headed to my capsule for sweet, sweet sleep. If you've never heard of capsule hotels, just imagine a morgue, except instead of a wall of tiny human freezers, it's full of neat, slightly larger sleeping areas, tall enough to sit up and use a laptop, and long enough to sleep in, but not much else. As I crawled into capsule 616, I noticed the little light indicator came on outside the capsule to indicate it was occupied. Sweet. I pulled the door down, played with every single knob on the wall just because I could, and once I figured out how to turn the lights off, my head hit the pillow and I was off to dreamland. For about 10 minutes. It wasn't long before I started hearing a voice through the walls. I guessed they were thinner than they looked and that my sleep hadn't plunged into deep enough territory for me to stay unconscious despite the mental and physical exhaustion. I tried to fall back to sleep, but the voice kept me up. It was constant, and I mean seriously non-stop. I didn't think she ever took the time to breathe. Imagine that one Eminem song. You know the one, right? It was like that, except it went on for easily half an hour. Because the sound was muffled, and because every syllable melded into the next, I couldn't make out what language she was speaking. I don't think it was Japanese. I don't know, I'm not a linguistic expert, but there weren't a lot of that A sound you hear so often in Japanese, and she was hitting those R's pretty hard, so if I had to guess, I think she might have been German? Whatever language it was freaking me out. That's when I remembered the buttons on the wall. I pawed around until I turned the lights on, and then found the knob for the white noise. Bless you, Japan, for your practical technology. My little capsule was soon filled with the sound of rain and thunder, easily overpowering the voice of my neighbor's capsule. I could still hear her, but she was a whisper in a typhoon. I dimmed the lights, closed my eyes. All was right in the world for, you guessed it, about 10 minutes. Intermixed with this synthetic storm was the wailing of a tornado siren. It took me a long time to realize it wasn't meant to be there and that it was coming from my neighbor. At this point, it was about 2 a.m. I was tired, I was cranky, I just wanted a few hours of sleep before another fun-filled day of adventure. I was internally cursing at whatever inconsiderate fucking tourist starts screaming in their goddamn capsule in the middle of the goddamn night, knowing full well everyone could hear her. In my frustration, I made one big mistake. I slammed my fist into the wall and screamed, "Shut the fuck up!" That was her invitation to start slamming back, and boy, she took it and ran with it. Screaming, she hit my wall so hard, I swear to God it felt like my entire capsule was shaking. It was like she was full-on body slamming it with all of her might, all while screaming so loud I could barely hear the storm anymore. I put my hand on the wall and I felt it buckle as she thrashed against it. I backed away into the opposite wall, but I could still feel every slam as though it was coming from the capsule to my left instead of my right. I'd had enough. I was going to see if the concierge was still awake and see what they could do about putting me on another floor or kicking this jerk out. I opened my capsule door and jumped onto solid ground. The little occupied light at the front foot of my capsule was off after a few seconds. The noise stopped, the banging ceased, and my breath caught in my throat. I looked at the light indicator under my neighbor's capsule. It was turned off. I could feel cold sweat pouring out of me. Just a broken light, right? That's what I hoped, but I guess I've read one too many horror stories because something compelled me to grab her door handle and slowly lift it. Yeah, the neighbor's capsule was empty. I spent the night on a bench in the locker room. I know I probably should have left entirely, but I was spent. The next morning, stiff and barely rested, I went down to the lobby and tried to explain what happened in my pitiful, broken-ass Japanese. The concierge looked confused, and even after using a translation service, I didn't get anywhere until she saw my bracelet with the room number. There was the slightest micro-expression of horror on her face. She pulled my arms towards her, gently took off the bracelet and flipped it around. I was supposed to be in capsule 919, not 616. That look on her face, though, I can still picture it in my mind's eye. I have a feeling it wasn't just a look of, "Oh dear, you were in the wrong capsule." I think she knew damn well what was going on. So yeah, I went to a hotel the next night. I hope you all enjoyed that first story. Have you ever stayed in a capsule hotel in Japan? If so, was your experience any and all terrifying like that one? Be sure to let me know in the comments section below. Now, without further ado, we're going to get into the second story on the podcast, written by the immensely talented S.H. Cooper, also known as Miss Pippinacious. I really hope I pronounced that correctly. She has a way of crafting horror, but also throwing in a little bit of wholesome there at the end for you. It kinda has become her thing, and I think she's the one that does it the best. With that said, let's not waste any more time and get right into the story, Drawing Out the Demons. People like happy. They respond to happy. Sad is a different story. One that's far shorter with fewer characters and less descriptors. Sad is in the thin leaflet you hide behind the brighter covers. No one really wants to know it's there. Not even you. Sad is uncomfortable. And so, I was happy. I had my work acquaintances, the kind you make small talk with while wishing you could be anywhere else. I had a few people I played video games with once or twice a week. I had a cat. Beyond that, my social circle was non-existent. My only real friend was Harper, and in the back of my mind, I sometimes wondered if she only stuck around because she was my sister. I never asked. I was too worried about what her answer might have been. I also didn't want to ruin the illusion. Smile, laugh, chit-chat about the fluffy stuff. Keep it light, and maybe you'll start to feel a little less dark. That's what I told myself anyway. If anyone realized that it was a front a good portion of the time, almost nobody said anything. Like I said, sad is uncomfortable. Harper and I talked a few times a week. Sometimes on video calls, but mostly just over voice chat. She'd tell me about her job, some fancy-sounding science gig that I'd never quite understood. I'd tell her about mine, editing local opinion pieces about how people who lived near an airport, which had existed before their neighborhood had been built, hated the airport. We'd swap video game stories, updates about friends, her art, my attempts at writing. She was one of the few people that could make me laugh, really, genuinely laugh. But sometimes after I was finished, she'd go quiet for a moment and then ask the question I hated most. So, you're okay, right, Sky? My go-to was to scoff and reply, "Of course, why do you ask?" She never had a good reason, just that I sounded off. I'd brush her off with an excuse of being tired and end the call. I wasn't about to burden the one person who actually made me feel less alone. I used to, turning on her and spilling my guts whenever I started to feel down. But now, between her career and being a newlywed, she had enough going on in her life without me adding to it. And I had my cat Bjorn, and bottles of wine. What more could a girl ask for? I was at a low point when it started. Dark thoughts, dark apartment, dishes and laundry piling up. The only thing I really cared about was making sure Bjorn was still looked after. Giving him fresh food and water was what got me out of bed. His playful mewls and need for attention kept me out of it. We'd sit together on the couch watching reruns of whatever was on while I nursed glass after glass of Moscato. I just drained my latest cup and was already hearing the sirens call for more. Bjorn rumbled happily when I moved him from my lap and got up to head to the kitchen. I tugged open the fridge door and started to reach for the wine. Something within the pale liquid moved. I froze, my fingers around the neck of the bottle, and squinted. I was, admittedly, already a bit tipsy and thought for a moment that it had just been a trick of the lights. Until the wine sloshed again and a dark shape zipped upward from behind the label. Slowly, I lifted the bottle from its spot on the shelf, suddenly queasy with the thought that I'd been drinking glorified cockroach bathwater. A cockroach would have been preferable to what was actually swimming around in my wine. Whatever it was exactly. The creature, no bigger than my palm, had long, spindly tentacles that were caught somewhere between octopus and jellyfish. As it propelled itself around, little chunks of its flesh, which was mottled with decay, were left floating in its wake. I gagged and extended my arm to hold the wine and its inhabitant away from my face. The sharp movement upset the thing and it launched itself at the side of the bottle toward me. It spread its tentacles against the glass and pressed its underside to it, revealing an all-too-human mouth that snapped and gashed its brown teeth. I shrieked and instinctively tossed the bottle away from me. It hit the floor and shattered. Shards of glass and wine spread across the linoleum, and I skittered backward, frantically searching for the monster, but it was nowhere to be seen. After locking Bjorn in my room where he couldn't get near the mess, I returned to the kitchen with a broom and held in both fists, raised and ready to smash whatever had come out of the bottle. Just like before, though, All I found was wine and broken glass. I cleaned the spot where it had fallen until my apartment stank of bleach and then looked through every cupboard and drawer I had. I crawled on my hands and knees with a flashlight to peer under tables and chairs. I never found the little octo monster. I took solace in another bottle of wine after thoroughly checking it out before I opened it, until I didn't have to think about it anymore. When I woke up with a nasty hangover the next day, it seemed pretty clear that I'd overdone the drinking, and my experience had been a result of my overindulgence. Embarrassing, to say the least, and waste of perfectly good wine. It was also a reminder of how bleak things were starting to seem. I'd become that woman who keeps her cat in the room so she can say she isn't drinking alone. Instead of being the wake-up call I might have needed, it just made me feel worse. I was failing. I didn't even know at what exactly, just that I was. I skipped the call with Harper that night. When she followed up with a text to see if I was okay, I told her I wasn't feeling well and I'd gone to bed early. It wasn't a lie. I was already buried beneath my covers, all the lights in my bedroom switched off. As soon as I hit send, I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and rolled over to stare at the wall. I drifted in and out of sleep, I guess, but while I was awake, I wondered how long I could stay there before anyone noticed. A day, a week? Would anyone but my sister even care? I didn't feel like I would, so why should they? A tight, heavy feeling crept into my chest, an oppressive ache that made me want to cry and scream, but at the same time made it too hard to do so. I flipped onto my back and inhaled a shaky breath to try and chase it away. The shuddering sigh echoed from under my bed. I sat upright, covers clutched to my chest. The sigh had turned to breathing, deep and ragged, and something dragged across the floorboard. It sounded like Bjorn's claws, but heavier. Much heavier. The breathing was getting louder and my king-size bed frame jumped slightly. The dragging sound was moving, I realized, through the white fog of fear in my head. It was slowly going from directly beneath me, off to one side. And the closer it got to the edge, the quicker and more eager it was becoming. Out in the hall, Bjorn meowed pitifully. His cries sent me reeling out of bed. I jumped as far as I could, hit the wall, and tumbled out into the hall where Bjorn was waiting. I slammed the door shut behind me and scooped up the cat before running into the living room, where I quickly realized I left my phone on the nightstand. With no landline, I had no way to call for help without leaving the apartment and knocking on the neighbors' doors. The more I thought about it, though, the crazier it sounded. How could I explain that there was a monster under my bed without coming off as delusional? There was no way. And I couldn't put any of this on Harper. Not again. I fell onto my couch and held Bjorn, who nuzzled me while I cried into his fur. What was happening to me? Of course, when I finally returned to my room with a kitchen knife, it was empty. Isolation is a funny thing. It feels freeing and cold all at once. I stopped going to work, didn't even call in, couldn't bring myself to. I also didn't answer Harper beyond a couple of texts telling her I needed some time to myself and not to worry. She still tried to call, and every few hours, my phone would ding with new messages or pictures she thought would make me laugh. I put my phone on silent and left it in a drawer. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment, hardly moving or eating. I didn't speak to anyone except Bjorn. I kept thinking it was time for me to answer my sister, but I just couldn't muster the energy to do so. My phone seemed too far away, and the words I would need were farther still. Being alone was easier. The only reason I could bring myself to leave was Bjorn. He was almost out of litter, and even in my current state, there was no justification good enough to let him suffer even the slightest bit. I tied my hair into a greasy bun, pulled on the cleanest clothes I could find, and trudged outside. It was already getting dark as I cut across the park and made my way to the nearest big box store. I grabbed a litter and a frozen pizza, paid, and started for home again. In the time it took me to get my things, the sun had gone down completely. I kept to the park this time, where it was the most well lit. It was a little less direct and longer than simply going through the grass, but it felt safer. There was a bridge over a pond in the middle of the park, and during the day, it was quite a pretty spot. At night, it took on a gloomier quality. The draping branches of the weeping willows around it reminded me of the octo monster from the wine bottles as their silhouettes moved with the breeze. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the nervous flutter in my stomach, but the closer I got to the bridge, the more uneasy I became. I felt like I was being watched. As I reached the footbridge, a shadow separated from one of the tree trunks. In the dim light, its outline was long and thin, standing almost twice as tall as it was. It carried itself slowly on 4 spider-like limbs that cracked painfully with each movement. The body itself seemed too bloated to be supported by those legs. It was coming towards me, and each step seemed to be agony for it, because it kept emitting low, guttural groans. I screamed and started to back up, my bag slipping from my hands as I fumbled for my keys. The thing in the dark kept coming. I yanked my keyring from my pocket and flipped on the smallest flashlight I clipped on there. Its frail beam landed on the thing, sweeping over its bone-white fleshed and tangled curtain of hair until it landed on its face. Or rather, my face. A mask of my features pulled into a fake too-wide smile was half hanging over its own flimsy strap. All I could see of its real face was a roving, bloodshot eye. When the light hit it, it hissed and squealed. That was enough for me. I unrooted my feet and tore back through the park all the way to the big box store, screaming the whole time. People typically have 2 reactions when you're an adult who says they see monsters: scorn or concern for your mental well-being. I got plenty of both, but I tried to recount the last couple of weeks of my life to others, but I just stopped repeating it. No one, not the police or doctors I saw, believed me. Not until I spoke to Harper. I felt awful when I pulled my phone out of its hiding place and dialed her number. She didn't need this, even if I did. It was wrong of me. No one else should have to deal with my sadness. I almost hung up. As I was about to, my sister's voice came on the line, and the relief I heard in it was enough to have me sobbing. After I could speak again, I told her everything. That I wasn't well and I'd been seeing things. I babbled about the octo monster, the boogeyman under my bed, the tall spider thing with a mask of my face. I poured it all out through gasps and tears, and Harper listened with quiet intensity. And then all she said was, "Hold on." I waited. My stomach knotted with icy certainty that this was going to be it, the thing that finally pushed her over the edge and made her realize how much better she was without me. Instead, she came back a few minutes later and told me to check my emails. There were 2 waiting for me when I checked. The first had 3 attachments. I clicked the first one. It opened to a charcoal sketch of a wine bottle. Floating inside of it was a small octopus jellyfish creature. Confused, I continued to the second. Another drawing. I recognized my own bedroom right away. A pair of claws, long and razor sharp, were just visibly poking out from underneath the bed. I didn't need to open the third one to know what it would be, but I did anyway. The spider thing, wearing my face as a lopsided mask, stared at me from its visible, oversized eye. "What are these?" I managed to ask. "They're your demons," Harper said softly. My sister knew me better than anyone. Even over the phone, she could read me. When I was in a bad place, when I'd been drinking and trying to hide it, when I'd shut myself off from the world, she knew, and she felt useless. She wanted so badly to help, but didn't know how, and I wasn't opening up to her anymore. In her frustration and upset, she turned to her art for release. the little demon that lived in the wine and fed my bad thoughts until they drowned out everything else. The nighttime demon that waited until I was alone and filled my head with doubt and worry. The ever-present demon that lurked behind all my fake smiles and clung to me with long, spindly legs so that I was forced to carry its heavy, suffocating body. The demons she'd seen in me even as I tried to hide them. The second email was a one-way plane ticket for a flight out to her city the next day. Her guest room would be waiting for me and Bjorn. It wouldn't fix things, she told me, but it was a start, and she'd be right there with me to take it one step at a time. We couldn't explain how those demons had gone from her page to my home, and right then, I didn't want to try. I just wanted to hug her for seeing me for who I was and not who I thought I was supposed to be. We'd talked about it many times in the months that followed, but we never came close to understanding what really happened. Eventually, we stopped trying. The how just didn't seem as important anymore. Simply knowing that it had, and the good that came after because of it, was enough for the both of us. Whew, that one was a doozy. I've always enjoyed S.H. Cooper's work because it has just a certain style to it that I really think holds its own in the horror world. Speaking of, we have a newcomer to the channel as far as authors go. I've done a couple of her stories in the past, but I haven't really done one of hers in a while. On Reddit, she goes by sleepyhollow_101 if you want to look her up, but her actual name is Rana Vasilar. She's incredibly talented, and she too has a way of just crafting an incredibly touching story while also putting in the horror elements. This story is one that really caught my eye, given what I've been doing on my YouTube channel lately as far as cold cases, missing persons, things of that nature. I do have to warn you that there is a not safe for work tag about child abuse on this story, so if you'd like to skip it, just go to the timestamp you see on screen. If you're listening to the audio only version, I will put in a timestamp here. But with that said, this is the story. 10 years ago, I took the picture of Jody Callanthrope. I took the picture of Jody Callanthrope. You know the one. It was all over the papers when she went missing. Her pretty blonde ringlets and apple blossom cheeks followed you everywhere you went for the first 2 years, always hoping she'd turn up. When she was pronounced legally dead, her parents held a memorial service. It was my picture that they used in place of a casket. No dead body to lay to rest, just memories and dead-end hopes to fill the empty spaces. Of course, at the time, I didn't know I was taking her very last picture. I was an amateur photographer, and I'd set up shop in the local mall for the day. Just a few lights and some backdrops. It didn't change much, because I was hoping to expand my portfolio and one day become a real professional photographer. I spent the day taking pictures of a few teenage girls, some kids, one or two adventurous mothers. And Jody, of course. I remember her most vividly of all, and not just because of her disappearance shortly afterward. It was because she practically bounced into my arms, all bubbly joy and pink frills. I know most 5-year-olds are probably like that, but with Jody it seemed different. I guess I'm not explaining it well. I've kept my thoughts on this subject to myself. I used to have this horrible feeling that her kidnapper must have felt the same way about her, and that's why he chose her instead of someone else. It doesn't matter. The point is, shooting Jody was a joy. She did everything I told her exactly as I told her to do it. The perfect model. I spent almost an hour with her, and at the end of the session, her mother paid me double my rate, just because she loved how happy my pictures made Jody. All in all, a successful day for me, which is why I was not expecting the police to come knocking on my door 2 nights later. Unofficially, I was a person of interest. Being one of the last people Jody interacted with, I guess it makes sense that they'd suspect me. But it didn't take long for the cops to decide I had nothing to do with it. I had a solid alibi for the night of her disappearance, and my DNA wasn't found at the scene. Apparently, there'd been a struggle in her bedroom, and they'd found some DNA that has never been identified. At any rate, they did come and ask questions, and wanted all the pictures I'd taken of Jody, which I was happy to provide. They chose the best of the bunch. A cute picture of her sitting with her crossed legs and a beaming smile to put in all the papers. And the rest, as they say, is history. They credited me with the picture. I thought that was kind of strange, to be honest, but it wasn't all bad. I have to admit, I got a lot of interest after that. Do you know how many people wanted to be photographed by me? And were actually willing to pay? It was like it had become some kind of morbid tourist attraction for people obsessed with mysteries and true crime stories. Sort of left a bad taste in my mouth working with those people, but they paid good money and I figured it wasn't really hurting anybody. Better they come bother me than go after her parents, right? Of course, I got some hate mail from people convinced that I'd murdered her, but those were few and far between. Eventually the fervor around her disappearance died down and I faded into obscurity. My photos got better, and I really did become a professional photographer. Made enough money to get by and everything. Once in a while, I'd get a question about Jody. What was she like? Did I sense something was off about her? Did I have any idea that something terrible was going to happen? But it became increasingly rare as time went by. This year is the 10-year anniversary of Jody's disappearance. There was a big article in the paper for her. People on the streets were whispering about her. What do you think ever happened to Jody Callanthrope? She was on our collective minds as the most famous mystery to ever come out of our sleepy little suburb. I should have been expecting a resurgence of interest in my photograph. But I wasn't, and it came as a surprise when he came walking into my store. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with thinning brown hair and pale skin. He was about my height, just under 6 feet, but he walked with a slouch that made him look smaller. He was wearing these old Coke bottle glasses, and he kept fidgeting with them as he talked. I was wondering, are you James Winterstein? As in the James that took that picture of Jody? I nodded and gestured for him to sit down in my little waiting room. That's me, what about it? I could tell he had questions, but didn't seem to know where to start. I waited patiently while he gathered his wits. I was just wondering, how did you manage to do it? A red flag went up in my mind. Did this guy think I kidnapped her? Of course he did. Just my luck. One of those delusional vigilantes had come to my shop to harass me. My voice came out harsher than I intended when I asked, "What are you talking about?" "How did you manage to capture her spirit so well?" he asked in a rush, oblivious to my abrupt change in tone. "I mean, every time I see that picture of her in the papers, I get goosebumps. It looks like I could reach out and touch her. Was there some kind of, I don't know, technique that you used? A special camera? What was it?" I relaxed a little at that. His curiosity seemed genuine enough. "I didn't do anything special," I said with a shrug. I just told her how to pose. She brought the life to all those pictures all of her own. He nodded a little, looking wistful. Yeah, that sounds like Jody, all right. You knew her? I asked. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I was their next door neighbor for a few years. Jody used to play in my yard. Sweet little kid. Terrible what happened to her. I nodded, and we chit-chatted for a bit after that. Just as he was leaving, he asked, "Do you think you could take some pictures of me, if you have the time?" "Sure," I said. "What did you want?" "If you give me your card, I can email you the details," he said. I gave him a business card and sent him on his way. Didn't think anything of it. Not until that night when I got his email. The subject line was an address. In the body of the email, it simply said, "If anyone can bring her to life, it's you." Suddenly, my interaction from earlier in the day didn't seem so innocent. Not one bit. I'm not some kind of shitty B horror movie, and I'm not stupid, so the first thing I did was call the police. 911, what's your emergency? Hi, my name is James Winterstein, and I got a weird email, and I know how it sounds, but I think it's connected to the disappearance of Jody Callanthrope. The operator sounded bored as she answered. I'm sure I wasn't the first person to call about Jody. They probably had lots of wackos over the years who thought they'd solved the mystery of Jody's disappearance. Can you tell me what was in the email, sir? Well, it's from a guy who came to my photography studio this morning. I'm the guy that took Jody's picture, the one that runs in the papers, and he came in asking me some questions about it. Just now, he sent me an email with the address and told me that if anyone can bring her to life, it's me. The operator was quiet for a few moments, and I had time to think about how painfully crazy that sounded. What was the address, sir? I repeated it to her. More silence. Sir, where are you now? I'm at home. Why? Please stay where you are. We'll send an officer as soon as we can. Do not leave the house. Lock all doors and windows. What? Why? What's happening? Please remain calm, sir. Give me your address and we'll have someone out to you as soon as we can. I gave her my address and hung up the phone, frustrated and unsettled. For one fleeting moment, I considered getting into my car and checking out the address anyway, but immediately put it from my mind. I'm not some kind of hero. I knew better than to get involved in whatever the fuck was happening. 2 hours later, an officer came by and insisted I come with him down to the police station, where I sat down and was questioned by 2 other officers for about a half an hour. At the end of it, one of the officers, Officer Elroy, took me aside and finally explained what was happening. Earlier this evening, we received a tip-off about Jody. Someone was claiming to have seen her at the address you gave us. The address belongs to a dilapidated cabin down in Woodreds Grove. When we arrived, we found her. My heart skipped a beat. You found Jody? She's alive? Officer Elroy gave me a sad look, and I felt my heart sink. No, son, she's not. She's been dead at least 3 days now. We'll have to do a DNA test to confirm the identity of the body, but at this point, we have no reason to believe it's anyone other than Jody Callanthrope. Shock numbed me to the core. You mean this whole time she's been here, in town, all these years? He sighed. Most likely. It's more common than you might think. The man you saw earlier this evening, we think he's connected to her death and her kidnapping. We're doing everything in our power to find him. If he's in contact with you again, we need you to contact us immediately." "He wasn't there at the scene?" He shook his head. The numbness left me and anger boiled in my chest. "I want to see her," I said. He opened his mouth, probably to refuse me, but I insisted. I was one of the last people to see her alive. I just want to see her. Please. Eventually, he shut his mouth and nodded. I followed him to the morgue. Before her parents had seen her or even informed of her likely discovery, they pulled down the sheet and I looked into the face of a girl I would recognize anywhere, even after all these years. I could see where her rosy cheeks had faded, her charming smile had thinned into a permanent frown. Her liveliness had drained into endless exhaustion. It was Jody, but then again, it wasn't. I stared at her for at least 10 minutes, and then I turned around and left. The next few weeks were a shit show. Jody's parents were devastated. The town was in shock. My phone was ringing off the hook. More obsessive freaks wanting to ask questions about Jody's picture. I ignored my phone, closed down the shop, and sat in my room. I drank, mostly, and tried to forget about the world, just to get away from it all for a little while. I did talk with Jody's mother a little. She'd kept in sporadic contact with me since Jody's disappearance, and though it sometimes made me uncomfortable, I couldn't find a way to shut her out. I always sort of felt like I owed it to her, to be there for her, even though it wasn't my fault and there's no way I could have prevented it. She asked me to come to the funeral, the real funeral. I kept thinking of a polite way to decline, knowing I wouldn't be able to, knowing I'd end up suffering through it. The cops checked up on me once or twice, kept tabs on me to make sure that her kidnapper hadn't tried to contact me again. He didn't, of course. Not dumb enough, I guess. I went to the funeral. I cried for a little girl I never knew. I took some more time off work, but eventually opened shop once more. Jody's parents sold their house and moved a few towns over. Can't say I blame them. Would you say if it happened to you? Life went back to normal. At least as normal as it can ever be after something like that. But normal became a thing of the past. This morning. Because this morning I opened my email like always. I skimmed the subject lines until I focused on the one that had been sent in the late last night and paused. Written there in black and white was my very worst nightmare. I'm still waiting for those pictures. And with that, we come to the end of Night Shift, Episode 1. It's time to flip back up the lights, crawl out from under your blanket, and get the day started. Thanks again, everyone, for showing up for Episode 1. If you enjoyed this format, please let me know. I'm not really sure how people are going to like this little intermission between the stories or introducing the stories, things like that. I know some people just like to go from one story to the next, but I want to be able to give you guys something to listen to for an hour, hour and a half-ish a day. Not a day. This is not going to be a daily thing. Sorry. This will most likely be a weekly or bi-weekly thing, just depending on how busy I am working on things for the YouTube channel and just life in general. But I do want to thank you all again for showing up, watching the video. Go ahead and share it. And I'm excited to see where this takes us. It's a little bit scary because I've never really launched anything before. But thank you all again one more time for listening. And please, stay safe out there. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of The Graveyard Shift with Mr. Davis. Firstly, I just want to thank you all for the incredible support on the first episode. The response blew my expectations out of the water and made me excited to make another one. With that said, let's not waste any more time and jump right into the first story. Our first one comes from author Easy Misery. I read a few of her stories on the channel in the past, and she never ceases to give me goosebumps. This is the story of the man who stands backward in the elevator. Ivory Hollows was a brand new building that I moved into after I graduated from college. It was a huge, monotone box that housed over 100 apartments. I liked it. I can't explain why, but the sight of a giant cube made me feel safe, secure. I enjoyed that every floor looked exactly the same. All the walls were gray and all the floors were black. Maybe it was my mathematics background, but it seemed like I fit in. As a bonus, I barely ever saw or heard any of my neighbors. It was like I was alone in a giant building. I loved the quiet. College life was always a bit noisy and people were always asking me for things. But in Ivory Hollows, I was like an integer, a number among many silent numbers. It was comforting. There was one glaring exception to the pattern. Every time I took the elevator, whether up or down, there was a man inside. He was a white man with dark hair that sat beneath a bowler cap. He was always wearing a silver suit fitted to his slender frame. I honestly would not have thought much of him except he was backward. In every trip he faced the back of the elevator as opposed to the front. I'd step in and stand awkwardly in the corner, faced sort of sideways so I didn't have my back to him. Needless to say, it was unsettling. I am a person of rituals and norms. I don't break the rules, I don't make a fuss. And I certainly don't stand backward in elevators. I talked it over with my cat. Should I say hello? Maybe he's blind and doesn't realize how to stand correctly. I could help him or something. She purred and rubbed against my hand. I scratched her absent-mindedly. Yeah, I'll say something tomorrow. Well, it took me 3 more days to talk myself up for it. My apartment was on the 10th floor, highest floor in the building. I was ready for work and pressed the down button. The elevator reached me, and like always, there was the man, his back to me. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. I took a few deep breaths. This might be awkward, but I needed to say something. I coughed and cleared my throat. Hello? The man didn't respond. Excuse me, sir? He didn't move, but he did make a slight grunting sound. Me? Yes, hello, my name is Tom. The man swayed a little. Tom, you say? I couldn't see his face, but he sounded old. Maybe he had dementia. What's your name, sir? He then started laughing. It was quiet at first, but it got loud quick. Without moving, he was full belly laughing. I inched away from him, glancing up at what floor we were on. I realized that we were on floor 10. We hadn't moved. I pressed the lobby button again. Nothing happened. I pushed the door open button. Nothing. In desperation, I pressed to call for help, but it was no use. The man was still laughing. I pounded on the elevator doors. Hello? Help! We're stuck in here! The laughter suddenly stopped. Trust me, you do not want to open these doors. I was already trying to open them myself, using whatever strength I had to pry them apart, even a little bit. I felt the man move closer to me. He backed up so his shoulders were nearly touching mine. This is your last warning. Just wait for it to go down. Get away from me! My hand slipped and I accidentally elbowed the man in the side. I swung around apologetically. He didn't move. I went around to face him and apologize, but I stopped. Something small stuck out to me. There was cat hair on his suit. Do you know what stood here before Ivory Hollows? He turned his palms up. A house. A single house that belonged to an ordinary family. They owned the land but couldn't pay the bank, so it was sold. They kicked out the perfect family and put this ugly box on their beautiful home. Why would they destroy something so perfect? I bit my tongue. Was it your house? No. The family didn't have any money, so they ended up on the streets. The mom killed herself before this place was finished being built. The dad brought his young son here, and they hid in the construction site. Once it was clear that nothing was going to change, the dad took the boy to this very elevator. He slit the boy's throat, right there on the floor. Not sure what happened to the dad. Maybe he's still here somewhere. Why are you telling me this? That's when the man turned his face to me. I stumbled back, horrified. It was my face. This man looked exactly like me. Because they stopped all construction on this building the day after that boy was killed. Are you saying... This is an empty building, Tom. So why are you here? The doors opened suddenly with a velocity I had never seen before. I ran out, dashing across the floor to my apartment. The halls were uncarpeted, the walls were unpainted. I opened the door to my home and found it completely empty. The only thing inside was a stray cat who hissed when I entered. I scoured the place, looking for any evidence I had lived there. I found two things: a bloody knife and a bowler cap. Jeez Louise, as if elevators weren't scary enough, right? I hope you all enjoyed that first story, because I know I did. Our next one comes from longtime supporter of the channel and one of my absolute favorite authors, Versatile. You may remember him from the grandfather serial killer story. It's one of the most, if not the most popular video on my channel, so I'm sure you're familiar. Get ready for a more terrifying tale. The story of the extra house. I've always known I'm bad. Mama and Papa try to be good to me, but I always make them mad. It always scares me when they get mad, and I don't like how it hurts, but the worst part is how sad they look when it's over. When they tell me how disappointed they are, how they wish I would stop making them do this. If I could only be smarter and better like my older brother, Thomas. Or at least learn to listen and stay out of the way. I really do try, but it never works. I always mess up something. We've always lived in the great house since I can remember. It had belonged to our grandparents before they died, and Thomas says that it was really nice back then. It seems nice enough to me now, but Thomas tells me it's a dump. That it started rotting the moment I was born. He says stuff like that to me all the time. But not around Mama and Papa. Around them, he's always so bright and sweet. I've learned to try and avoid being alone with Thomas, but it never works out that way. He's so much bigger and stronger and smarter than I am, and he likes it too much. When he hurts me, he never looks sad. He just grins and grins. There's a big field behind our house. I think at one time my grandparents farmed it, but now it's mainly rocks and weeds. I'd slip away to the field when no one notices, which is often enough, and I like playing by myself anyway. I figure if they forgot about me, maybe I won't make them so sad or mad anymore. But one day, when I stepped into the backyard, I saw the field was different. There was an extra house back there, just like ours. Well, not just like ours. It was bright and clean, with neatly trimmed hedges and beautiful flowers lining the walk up to the front porch. There were no vines growing over the columns, and all the shutters looked like they'd been painted and hung just right. I felt my heart flutter happily at the sight of it, but I also knew I must be in a dream. Not wanting it to end yet, I walked up the path into the front door. It was really amazing. Everything was the same, but not the same at all. The wood of the door almost glowed with some kind of varnish or lacquer, and I finally got to see the large brass door knocker that had been gone from our front door for as long as I can remember. The thought of our house made me look back, and I half expected my house to be gone. But it still sat there, faded and gray, looking worn out and shabby next to this miracle. Still, I felt my stomach starting to rumble with worry at the strangeness of all this. I pinched myself, thinking it might wake me up, but nothing happened. This was all too real and all too clear. It wasn't a dream after all, and that scared me a little. I started backing down the porch steps when the front door suddenly opened. It was Mama, except it wasn't. This woman looked 20 years younger, with none of the deep lines or yellowed skin that set Mama's face into a permanent weary scowl. This woman was beautiful, and she was smiling at me, telling me to come in, they've been waiting for me. Her voice sounded like music, and despite my earlier fear, I found myself following her inside. My heart leapt at what I saw there. Papa, a younger, kinder-eyed Papa, was coming down the stairs and sweeping me up in a huge hug before I could react. My first impulse was to freeze, hoping that by being still and quiet, I wouldn't do anything to make them upset. But then I heard him laughing as he danced around with me and realized he wasn't holding me roughly at all. And there was Thomas, looking at me like he was really happy to see me, not just wearing a fake face until we were all alone and he could give me that sly, awful grin. And the room he was coming from wasn't dark and filled with junk and trash. It, and the entire house, was filled with good smells and light and love. That was the thing that struck me the most. I could feel the love radiating from the other version of my family. It seemed to touch everything like some kind of warmth, and I could feel it seeping into my skin as they hugged me and led me into the living room. That was the thing that struck me the most. I could feel the love radiating from this other version of my family. It seemed to touch everything like some kind of warmth, and I could feel it seeping into my skin as they hugged me and led me into the living room. They sat me down and took turns talking, telling me how happy they were to see me, how glad they were that I had come. That's when I heard the floor creak behind me. I turned around to find a girl that looked like me standing there. I felt another moment of panic and strangeness of it all, but she was around the sofa and on me, hugging me tightly as she laughed. She whispered in my ear that this was the best day ever now, and that we would be just like sisters forever and ever. I knew I was crying, but it was only because my heart was so full and happy. It was hard when I had to leave and go back to my old house that afternoon. I didn't want to go, but the new papa said I had to for now. That I had to keep them and that house a secret until I could stay with them for good. I asked how long it would be, and he said not long at all. In the meantime, the new mama said I should come and stay every day as long as I wanted, just so long as I made it back to the old house before I'd be missed. The next 3 days were both wonderful and terrible. I'd start the day scared the extra house would be gone, and then excited when I saw it out of my window. I'd end the day sad that I had to leave, and then anxious for the next day to come. It was also getting harder to understand why my old family treated me like they did. I knew I wasn't smart and pretty and good like the other me, but my new family still seemed to love me a lot and treated me wonderfully. Why couldn't my old family do that? Maybe that's why I acted pert with Papa one morning. He had hit me for being slow at the table, calling me a stupid, dirty little thing. Normally, I would have just lowered my head and sat down quietly, hoping to make myself small enough and quiet enough that he would forget me. But this time I looked up at him. I asked him why he treated me like that he ought to not do that. I knew it was a mistake as soon as the words left my lips. His eyes blazed to life, and as he grabbed for me, I only barely stumbled out of his reach. Mama had overheard and was heading for me too, but I was quick and headed out the back door. I could hear them yelling behind me, telling me to come back or it would be worse, but I knew better than to stop. I hit the yard with my belly aching, a sour mixture growing there of sadness and fear and the terrible sureness that my new house would finally be gone. But it was there. And what's more, my new family was already coming down from the porch to meet me. I ran to new Papa, feeling a surge of relief and gratitude as I reached his legs and felt his comforting hand patting my shoulder. When I looked back, I saw that old Mom and Papa were in the backyard now, but they had slowed to a stop. They were looking at me, but they seemed to finally be able to see my new family in the extra house too. They looked terrified. Baby girl. Oh God, what is that? What are those? Come away from that thing. My old Papa's voice was high and shrill, and his eyes were rolling in his head like a scared cow. Shit, Millie. Fuck, how does it move like that? Come here, now. Old Mama was shielding her eyes like she was looking into the sun, and after another moment, they were both backing away. Old Thomas had started to come outside at the commotion, but before he could reach the yard, old Mama and Papa were running back inside with him in tow. My new Papa looked down at me with a smile. Don't you worry about them, Millie. You go on in the house. Me and your mom are gonna go sort them out. He tapped me lightly on the nose and started walking toward the old house with my new mama, even as my new brother and sister took my hands and led me inside my new home. They were laughing and hugging me, saying I could finally stay with them forever. That night was the happiest I've ever been. Mama and Papa came back a bit later and we had a big party. They said it was to celebrate me coming to stay. We played games and ate good food, and nobody got mad or hurt. It was after midnight when we finally went to bed, and I found out I got to have my own room right next to my new sister's. just like the rest of the house. It was like something out of a dream. The walls were painted with jungles and animals, and the ceiling looked like a beautiful night sky filled with stars. I didn't think I'd ever be able to sleep, but my new bed was so warm and soft, it wasn't long before I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. When I woke up, it was still dark, but I could see a little from the moonlight coming in from the window. My new family was around me, kneeling down along the sides of my bed. I didn't understand why at first and wondered if it was some kind of fun new game. Then I realized their mouths were on my legs and arms. They were biting me a little. It didn't hurt, but I still felt a bolt of fear that caused me to sit up and let out a small scream. They all stopped and looked at me, their eyes shiny and their mouths glistening in the silvery light. Mama patted my arm comfortingly. "It's all right, honey. We're not going to hurt you. We love you." My sister giggled. "We just need a little bit from you so we can stay. So we can all be together always." Papa nodded in agreement before looking at me. "Isn't that what you want, sweetheart? To stay with us forever?" I was already nodding as he finished the question, and within seconds of laying back down, I was somehow back asleep. The next morning, I looked out at my old house and saw it looked different. Instead of just looking worn down, it looked like it was rotting or drying up somehow, like an old apple left out in the sun. By the third day, it had started to collapse in on itself, and within a week, it had blown away like forgotten autumn leaves. I love my new life here. Sometimes I get very tired, and lately I almost feel like I'm stretched thin, but that's okay. It's only some of the time, and it's a small price to pay to help my new family. I love them so much, and they love me. Finally, we have a story from S.H. Cooper. You all should be very familiar with her work at this point. I've been a long-time supporter of her work because it always surprises me. I can never really guess where the story is going to end up, and I find myself excited to read all the way through. This story was no different. Listen along and tell me, do you know where the babies go? Do you know where the babies go when the sun is set and sinking low, crying all day, quiet all night? How many babies are down the Hag's Delight? 1, 2, 3. Every little girl in my town knew the Down Hag's ditty. We chanted while jumping rope, counting off how many times we could jump without a misstep. Nobody thought much about the words. It was just something everyone grew up with. I was about 10 when I finally learned where it came from. I'd been annoying my brother a lot that day. My friends and I had been running around laughing and making noise. Freddie stuck his head out the window and shouted at us to knock it off. I just stuck my tongue out at him. When we started jumping rope to the Down Hag's ditty, he came stomping downstairs and shouted at us from the porch. He was trying to study, he said. I knew he was really just reading comics. If you don't pipe down, the Down Hag will come eat you. We laughed at him. Freddie continued to fume. He leapt off the porch and snatched the jump rope from Cassidy's hands. He wagged the plastic end at us, warning us again that our noisiness would get us eaten. My friends complained at him to give us the rope back, but I wasn't so interested in our game anymore. I'd always been drawn to creepy things, and from the way my brother was talking, there was a story behind our jump rope chant that I really wanted to hear. I chased him back inside, up to his room, and stood in his doorway, demanding to know more about the Down Hag. Freddie told me to buzz off, but I planted my hands on my hips and stared him down until he finally relented. "You know Goosedown Hollow?" he asked. I did. It was what everyone called the woods just outside of town. We spent our summers swimming in its pond. "You know where its name comes from?" Freddie pressed. I shook my head. "There's a grave there," he said. He was talking in as dark and ominous a voice as a 12-year-old could manage. My brother told me that 100 years ago, shortly after our town had been founded, a lady had lived in those woods. She'd been one of the villagers, but after having a baby, she changed. She became short-tempered and violent, and there was nothing she hated more than the sound of her own child's cry. One night, her husband came home to discover her sitting in front of the fire in a rocking chair. She was smiling for the first time since giving birth, and she was covered in blood. When her husband asked what happened, she just looked up and said, "What glorious quiet." The whole village searched for the baby, but he was never found. They chased the woman out of the village, but she continued to live in the woods nearby. They thought she'd die from hunger or exposure out there, but she didn't. She thrived in the silence. But as the village grew, more babies started being born and their cries carried. One by one, the infants began to vanish from their cradles until only the quietest remained. The villagers knew it could only be one person. They stormed the woods and spent days and days searching for the woman until they came upon her little campsite in the very middle. It was in the center of a ring of trees, each with a hollow in their trunks. Goose down filled the openings. While the men kept the women from fleeing, the woman dug through the hollows. The feathers inside were stained with blood, but they didn't find the babies. They demanded to know what she'd done with their children, but she could only laugh and cry and laugh and cry. In their rage, the villagers hung the woman from one of the hollow trees. Once she was dead, they burned her shelter down and buried her beneath its ash. After they carved crosses in the trees around her to bind her spirit to that spot, they left, hoping to never speak of her again. It was said, though, that if a particularly fussy baby was born in the village, they'd hear a restless pacing coming from the woods and a woman's low voice moaning for silence. And if you go into the woods and find where she's buried, you best leave quick and quiet as you can. You also better hope you don't have a baby with you. She still can't stand to hear them crying. If she's disturbed, she'll claw out of the ground and snatch you up. Freddie crowed, and I gasped when he jumped at me. Now, I had a bad habit as a kid. I'd get ideas in my head and wouldn't be able to shake them, not that I tried very hard, and when the Down Hag story took root, it was all I could think about. I asked my parents about it, but they thought I was a bit too young for such a gruesome tale. Freddie had told me they knew about it already. I tried to discreetly look into it at the school library, but I was nervous that Miss Powders, the prickly librarian, wouldn't approve, and she'd kick me out, so that didn't go anywhere either. All I really wanted to know was how true the story was, but getting that information wasn't going to be easy. I decided if I wanted to prove or disprove the Down Hag, I'd just have to figure out where in the woods she was buried. The first thing I did was try and recruit some friends into helping me. I told them the same story Freddie had told me, and explained that Goosedown Hollow was named after that on account of the feather-filled trees. Most didn't believe me, and some were too scared of the story to want to try to find the hag's grave. Only my best friend Sydney agreed to help me look. We were able to find a few maps of the area in our houses, but neither of us knew the first thing about reading them. We tucked them into our old backpacks we planned to bring anyway, just in case we suddenly figured them out. We reasoned that the town had to be bigger than it was when the hag was killed so long ago, so we wouldn't have to go looking as hard as the villagers had. For the next week, we planned in secret. We snuck snacks and water bottles to our rooms and tried a few more times to make sense of the maps. We also asked for books on local history, hoping to find something about the Down Hag, but it was all boring stuff about people with names like Josiah and Elijah. When Saturday arrived, we told our parents we were going to the pond. The weather had started to warm up, so they allowed it, but told us to keep an eye on each other and not stay out after dark. Cindy and I rode our backs across town to the pathway leading into Goosedown Hollow. It was hard to think of those woods as creepy. I had been going in and out of them since I was small, and the well-worn trails were familiar, especially the ones leading to the pond. I'd never seen anything like what had been in Freddy's stories, a ring of trees marked with crosses around a clearing. Cindy hadn't either. But we rode around, going down all the dirt pathways we knew so well. "We're doing it wrong," Cindy huffed after we'd covered the usual ground. "We gotta go in the woods." "We are in the woods," gesturing to all the trees around us. She shook her head. "No, we gotta go off trail." "We're not supposed to." It was the first twinge of hesitation I'd felt. Of course, I should have realized it wouldn't have been as simple as just going up and down existing trails, but Mom had very plainly told me not to go off track. Cindy was insisting though, and I really did want to make a genuine effort to find the hag's grave. We left our bikes tucked against a thick tree and headed deeper into the woods. After a while, all the trees looked the same. We argued over what actually constituted as a clearing, whether a certain scrape on bark looked like crosses, and which direction we'd come from. What had started as a fun adventure was quickly becoming annoying and tiresome. Cindy was even more fed up with it than I was. She yelled at me for dragging her out to hunt some stupid urban legend. I yelled back that she had volunteered to come. We continued to snip and squabble until I just wanted to go home. I told Cindy I'd have enough, and she grumpily agreed. We turned around and started back. Except back wasn't right. We walked for what seemed like ages, but couldn't find our bikes on any of the paths. We wandered farther than we'd meant to and completely lost track of where we were. The more the day dragged on, the harder it was becoming not to panic. The Down Hag was forgotten. All I could think about was how much trouble I'd be in if I wasn't home in time for dinner. Cindy's frustrated grunts and groans were getting higher pitched and frightened. "What if we can't find our way out?" she asked. Her voice squeaked. "We will," I said. But by sunset, we still hadn't. Cindy had had enough. She dropped into the ground on her backside, her face screwed up in an effort not to cry. I tried to comfort her with some gummy bears and water, but she pushed them away. Tears were leaking down her cheeks. I put an arm around her shoulders and tried to reassure her again, but it just seemed to make things worse. She started to sob. No matter what I said, Cindy just cried harder and harder until her face was red and her eyes were puffy. I just sat next to her, helpless and fighting off my own tears. Leaves rustled, disturbed, off to our side. I looked towards the sound, but didn't see anything and assumed it was a squirrel or something similar running across the ground. I was too concerned with Cindy and our predicament to be worried about it. Cindy didn't even seem to notice it. The leaves crunched again. It was a heavier sound that time, and there was something odd about it. An agitated quality, like someone was walking back and forth. I put a hand on Cindy's arm and pressed a finger to my lips. She continued to hiccup and sniffle loudly. The first time I heard the moaning, I thought it came from her. She went quiet though, her bloodshot eyes wide as she stared up at me. "Was that you?" she whispered. A deep gurgling moan from behind some nearby trees cut off any response I might have had. I don't know if I just imagined it, or if I really heard the word silence whispered harshly, but I was up and screaming. Cindy was beside me, even after I'd started running. I was sure of it. I could hear her frantically fumbling to keep up the way she shrieked. But I didn't look back. I just kept running, wild and blind, and the whole time I kept hearing that awful, gasping, gurgling moan. The kind a woman with a broken neck might make. Maybe there was a rush of footsteps behind us. I can't say for sure. I just kept going, and I didn't look back. It was nighttime when I stumbled onto a trail. I was choking for air, barely able to stay upright, but I dragged myself along it until the lights from the street lamps were visible. When I heard a voice calling my name from up ahead, I started to scream again, but this time I wanted to be found. My dad caught me just as I started to collapse, and I clung to him, begging to go home. He hugged me tight and then forced me back so that I could look into his pale, stricken face. "Where's Cindy?" he asked. The woods were thoroughly combed by cops and volunteers. Dogs were even brought in. For 3 days, I sat in front of the television watching the search for my best friend unfold. No one blamed me for what they saw as an innocent venture turned tragic. They assumed we'd stumbled across a drifter type who'd become violent. I was told I'd been lucky to get away and that I'd done the right thing. I don't believe it, nor did I think I was so blameless. I kept running. I didn't look back. Cindy was never found. Only her blood recovered from goose feathers stuffed into the hollow of a tree. Do you know where the babies go when the sun is set and sinking low? I don't, but wherever it is, I'm certain that's where Cindy is too, and I'll never forgive myself for it. And with that, we conclude this episode of The Graveyard Shift with Mr. Davis. I hope you enjoyed all these stories. That last one really gave me some goosebumps. I'm all for urban legends, and this one was just absolutely terrifying. Thank you again, everyone, for the continued support on this. I still can't believe the amount of support the first episode got, but let's just hope this second episode does just as well, and we'll continue doing it on hopefully a bi-weekly basis. I don't want to overwork myself or the editor or anything like that. Anyway, thank you again so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to drop a like and share it with someone you think will enjoy it as well. I will see you very, very soon with a brand new video, but until then, stay safe out there.